So good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Spencer panel discussion. We are looking forward to a good discussion and invite you to share your questions in the Q&A section in the bottom of the webinar. And if we do not get your question today, we'll do our best to email you an answer after the webinar. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists today. Joining us today is Dr. Jennifer Seelig from the Spencer Foundation. She's an associate program officer. She holds a PhD in educational policy studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is an alumna of the Ohio University. Jennifer's research is situated at the intersection of educational equity and social spatial identities. She applies critical theory and qualitative methods to study the political economy of rural America, including the rural teacher pipeline, the role of schools in community development, and civic capacity in rural communities. Prior to joining Spencer, she was the assistant director of the Rural Education Research and Implementation Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and held a postdoctoral research position at Northwestern University. Welcome to Dr. Seelig to the panel today, and thank you so much for joining us. We also have joining us today Dr. Rochelle Gutierrez with the College of Education. She's a professor in curriculum instruction, and she received her PhD from the College of Education at the University of Chicago. Dr. Gutierrez's scholarship focuses on issues of identity and power in mathematics education, paying particular attention to how race, class, and language affect teaching and learning. Her current research projects focus upon developing in pre-service teachers the knowledge and disposition to teach powerful mathematics to urban students, the roles of uncertainty, tension, and nepenthe in teaching, and the political knowledge that mathematics teachers need to effectively rehumanize mathematics in an era of high stakes education. Also joining us today, we're having a little technical difficulty, but we're going to get Kevin in here real soon. Is an associate professor with the School of Social Work. He received his PhD from the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. Professor Tan's research focuses on understanding profiles of youth risk and protective factors, developmental patterns of problem behaviors, and their social contextual influences based on in-person orientated developmental psychopathology perspective. His work focuses on interventions, the target pattern specific of developmental risk. Both Dr. Gutierrez and Tan have received Spencer grants and will share today a little about the process and their work with Spencer. I want to thank both of them for their time today.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm just going to kick things off by telling you how this is going to proceed. We're going to start with Jenny talking a little bit about the Spencer story and moving into kind of where Spencer is going a little later on. Kevin, hopefully, will be the second speaker and talk about his research and the trajectory that started with a Spencer Small Grant. Then we will transition to Rochelle, who will talk about her current research and how that's been affected in the pandemic. She has a Spencer Large Grant, and then hopefully Jenny will close with a little bit about how Spencer is looking forward in the current context. And then we hope we'll have a lively discussion based on questions that you submit and have been submitted earlier. So I'm just going to turn it over to Jenny, and I will buzz you when we are at the 9-minute mark, let's say. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rajiv. And I know Lisa is going to share our slides in just a moment. Okay, so I would just like to, ground my comments today by offering a brief reflection on where the Spencer Foundation is situated. So the Spencer Foundation sits on the ancestral and traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. So this area has also been home to other tribes such as, you can go back, as Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox. The region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, trade, and maintain kinship ties. Today, one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States resides in Chicago. So as a staff at the Spencer Foundation, we are continuing to learn and grow in our relationships with Indigenous and American Indian communities and through our work. Next slide. So briefly, though Lisa already did a really nice job with my introduction, I will talk a little bit about my own journey as an early career scholar into this position as a program officer with Spencer and where I might go next. And you heard me right. So program officers at Spencer are not lifetime appointments or permanent positions. We are on limited term contracts. And so this is a very different model than a lot of the federal programs and other philanthropic foundations. And in this way, we always have new scholars with different perspectives on research joining the foundation and lending their knowledge and experience to grant-making processes. So the perspectives that I bring are that of a former high school Spanish teacher in Baltimore City and in rural Appalachia, as well as my research focus on school community relations, education leadership, and the politics of education. So this photo here is of a mural at a rural school in northern Wisconsin, where I conducted my dissertation research. And as Lisa mentioned, I draw upon critical geography and sociological theories to examine rural schools specifically and their centrality to community development and to rethinking the rural teacher pipeline. While I also advocate for a strengths-based approach to rural research, instead of the often deficit and homogenous framing of rural people and places. And at Spencer, I'm able to bring this perspective as a lens to consider our equity work, which I'll talk more about today, and the intersection between race, place, and education, while also gaining an understanding of the trends in cutting-edge scholarship in the field. Next slide. So the Spencer Foundation has been a leading funder of education research since 1971. And founder Lyle Spencer believed that the education research was key to improving education and increasing opportunities to learn for children and adults through the lifespan. So we focus exclusively on funding research on education and learning broadly defined. So what this means is that first, we are focused on learning wherever it occurs and across the lifespan. And while we fund only in education, we welcome a broad range of topics, theories, and methodologies in the projects we fund. And then second, we count on good ideas from the field. So we know we can't come up with all of the interesting questions and designs, and we see principal investigators and their ideas as essential for helping improve education. So our current president, Dr. Naila Suad Nasir, began her tenure with the foundation in 2017. And Dr. Nasir came to Spencer from UC Berkeley, where she was Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion. And much of her career was spent thinking about, or has been spent thinking about, how we make the world more equitable and more inclusive. And when you think a lot about equity and inclusion, it's very important to be transparent and intentional. So from that perspective, Spencer was an interesting place for her to arrive, because part of its mystique was the combination of the rigor in respect to the research that it represents and the mystery about how funding decisions are made. Next slide. So in Naila's first year as president, Spencer staff visited 40 schools of education, including those of you here at Illinois a few years back, and met with AERA, special interest groups, and surveyed scholars from across the field. So some of the things that we learned during this listening tour included that scholars wanted their research to matter and to help improve the world, and that they worry about the disconnect among research, policy, and practice. Scholars also want more time to think together and work collaboratively, and they're committed to responding to pervasive inequalities. So overall, we heard loud and clear that scholars want to do their work in a way that does not reify longstanding power relationships between the researcher and the researched. Next slide. So we then spent the next year figuring out how what we heard during the listening tour was going to influence our work and our funding. So one important outcome of this process was to prompt us to be more explicit about our goals and our values, and ensuring that our funding priorities and internal processes align with these goals. So our overarching goal is to support and serve the field. And to that end, we are committed to research and internal processes that are rigorous, meaning intellectually ambitious, innovative, and methodologically sound, that they're relevant, touching on the most pressing questions and opportunities in education, equitable, representing a diversity of scholars and scholarship contributing to learning improved environments grounded in justice, transformative, meaning reaching beyond academic audiences and leading to lasting improvement in education and learning, and collaborative, as in engaging expertise and perspectives across disciplinary boundaries, institutions, practitioners, families, and communities. So under Naila's leadership and through these commitments, we are working to position the foundation as a leading voice in the field, recognizing trends in research and reimagining possibilities in education and in education research. Next slide. So in 2022, Spencer will celebrate its 50th anniversary, and we have a variety of activities planned for the next couple of years. While the foundation has done great work in contributing to high quality research and research training, it's time to lean forward into the tensions and challenges that the field is holding around equity. So this is a pivotal moment in our field and in the world of education. So you'll notice that this slide says what's changing at Spencer rather than what's new. This reflects the changes that are underway but far from complete. With this in mind, I won't belabor every change at Spencer, but rather give you sort of a high level sense of where we're going. So all of these changes are rooted in an equity framework that is guiding not just our grant making, but also other internal and external processes. As Naila likes to say, you can't help create out in the world what you can't create in your own organization. So this means as a foundation, we need to be deeply equity centered ourselves. So for example, we created and launched our new large grants program, which supports studies that are transformational in that the work contributes new knowledge with potential for lasting impact on educational discourse. And I know that Rochelle is going to share about her large grant today. So these grants are intended for multidisciplinary and multi-generational project teams with clear dissemination plans to show how research will be shared with audiences beyond the academy. We also revised our research practice partnership program to have a clear focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Specifically, we are looking to support partnerships that attend to a mutualistic and equitable governance structure while engaging deeply in problems of practice rooted in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've also developed focused inquiry initiatives. We heard from the field that scholars wanted more time to collaborate with colleagues across disciplines on the most pressing issues facing the field of education. So we're now piloting new initiatives that will bring together scholars, practitioners, policymakers, and journalists across disciplinary and methodological boundaries to clarify what we know from existing research, identify promising future directions for research, and build networks in these important areas. So we heard in our field engagement also that people did not always think the Spencer Foundation was for them or supported their kind of work. So we believe that a healthy system is a diverse system, and we are committed to ensuring that our grant making includes a diversity of institutions, methods, and scholars, and that our systems and processes reflect that goal. So one system we're overhauling is our review process. So if you have applied for a Spencer grant, pre maybe 2016, 2017, then you might not have received any reviews when you found out your funding decision. But now we are widening our circle of reviewers and providing them with more support to write effective reviews. I can talk more about this later, but all proposals that are submitted to the foundation will now, regardless of funding decision, receive 2 external reviews that will be sent on to the PI at the end of the review process. Also, if you're interested in reviewing for us, we welcome you to open an account on our submission portal and supply information on your areas of expertise and methodologies. The reviewing, I think, is a great way to see the scope of projects that we receive and to see examples of excellent proposals. And we're also trying to leverage our website and other communications materials to be more transparent. And finally, we heard people say that they want their research to matter. We are committed to elevating the public discourse around education by making it more evidence-based. And one example is our commitment to education journalism. And another is a pilot program that we are currently running that works together with grantees to learn strategies for how to broadly communicate their research. Next slide. So I know you're all thinking this is good to know, but what about conducting research in a pandemic? So when the pandemic began last March, we immediately pivoted our attention to getting out in front of our grantees' fears regarding what we would expect as their funder during such a time. You can go back a slide. During such a time of crisis. So as Naila put out a statement to this effect, sort of immediately, asking folks to not stress about their research, but to return to their families and their loved ones and to be safe. At that time, I was leading personally the conference grant program, and we emailed all of our recent grantees with scheduled conferences over the next few months and made ourselves available for discussions. We offered no-cost extensions and reallocations of budgets, and we counseled as best we could in an unknown moment. So across our research grant programs, we did this same process. But importantly, Spencer has always provided no-cost extensions and reallocation of budget options. So if you receive a grant and you find yourself in a predicament, always reach out to us and we will help you make the best decisions for you, your work, and stay true to the foundation's commitments. Also, as many of you know, we ran a rapid response research grant program focused on the immediate need for education research as the pandemic closed schools, reshaped the public's perception of teachers and the purposes of schooling, deepened inequality seemingly overnight, and turned homeschooling on its head. So the RFP for that program supported 2 categories of projects. One was those that aimed to understand and disrupt the production and deepening of educational inequality. And the second was those that were focused on creatively reimagining educational opportunities. And the response was overwhelming. We received a record-breaking 1,369 submissions over the 3 cycles. Proposals came in from far and wide with every region in the US represented and quite a number of international proposals. Ultimately, we awarded 20 for funding. Following the 3 grant periods during last summer, we closed the special program. However, we welcomed and we continue to welcome COVID-related projects in all of our grant programs. And as you can see on our website, we also conducted a rapid analysis of the granted awards, finding themes and tensions across the field that we shared in a blog post, including the parameters of our review process. All of these public-facing engagements are affirmations of our commitment to transparency. And beyond scholars who are already in the Spencer Network, as well as those seeking funding in these tumultuous times, the Foundation is also doing what we can to hold the field level perspective of traumatic changes taking place wherever learning occurs and across the lifespan. As I'm sure many of you have seen, Spencer partnered with AERA last summer to conduct focus groups with early career scholars, postdocs, and graduate students, with specific focus groups for women of color, doctoral students of color, and early career scholars of color. In the middle of data collection, George Floyd was murdered and people took to the streets in protest, which also influenced the discussion in focus groups and the study's findings. This report is publicly available under the What We're Learning tab on Spencer's homepage, and I believe on AERA's website as well.
Jenny?
So I mentioned all of this, yep, I'm done.
Okay.
I mention all of this as a way to illustrate that while Spencer is a leading philanthropic organization in education research, we ultimately see our work as supporting the work of scholars. And oftentimes that means making visible the inequities in our educational systems that perpetuate inequities in scholar training and access to resources. Apologies, my second section is only 3 minutes.
That was great. I let you go a little over just because of the technical glitches, but man, that was impressive. You got through everything in a short amount of time. Kevin, I'm so glad you made it. My heart was racing a little bit because I saw you and then you got bounced off and now you're back. So without further ado, I'm going to let Kevin begin his presentation. Lisa, maybe you can sort out the slides. I just want to say one thing, and that is it was a pleasure to host President Nasir when she came, and it's even a greater pleasure to see that she made good on all of those promises that she talked about when she was here, as Jenny just listed, the review and sort of changing the perspective of the foundation. That's been really terrific to see that being put into action. So Kevin, take it away, please.
Thank you. I'm glad we worked out the technical difficulties, and thank you for this opportunity to be here to share with you my work. I'm currently in my 5th year, and let me clarify the wonderful introduction Lisa had. I'm still an assistant professor. I've not received tenure yet. I'm not associate professor. But that's it, time flies. Rajiv would probably have seen my progress over the last 5 years, particularly how my Spencer Small Grant has launched my career. And I appreciate all the support that the Foundation Relations Office have provided. Next slide, please, Lisa. And you could click another time. Thank you. Now, my area of research is in social and emotional learning. And more recently, in response to contemporary social events, I pivoted my work to examine the ways social and emotional learning serves to be a lever for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in schools. And prior to entering into academia, I used to work as a school social worker for 6 years in Singapore and in the United States before I entered a doctoral program at the University of Chicago. And while at Chicago, I spent time working with faculty in the area of schools, and I noticed certain gaps in the social and emotional learning literature. First, there was a lack of attention on the high school years, as a lot of the literature has focused on the younger ages. And secondly, there was a lack of knowledge on co-occurring social and emotional issues. What do I mean by that? Consider outcomes for a student with communication problems only. Outcomes would likely be different as compared to another student with co-occurring communication and anxiety problems at the same time. And I started my career here in Illinois, trying to establish a body of knowledge on this age-old question of trying to understand what treatment or intervention by whom is most effective for this individual or groups of individuals with this specific problem and under what set of circumstances. And this question has strong relevance for school practice. If you have worked in schools, you have heard of the multi-tiered systems of approach or the response to intervention model to supporting students. And what I was planning to do was to support schools in developing a social-emotional multi-tiered systems of support. Next slide, please. And when I first joined Illinois, I heard about the Campus Research Board grants, small campus grants that supports faculty research. And in my first semester, I applied for it. And lo and behold, I secured one that allowed me to work with one high school in our local Urbana-Champaign community to do universal screening with their freshman class. Lisa, next click, please. I will not go into all the details here, but what I would think is that my campus research board grant was instrumental in helping me to secure my Spencer Foundation small grants. It allowed me to make a case that understanding patterns of social emotional learning, it matters in understanding student outcomes. In brief, that work was I was finding 5 co-occurring patterns of social emotional needs. I will not go into the details. Next slide, please, Lisa. But this is one group of 9th grade students that I observed in my data that generated some amount of discussion with teachers and administrators when I disseminated my findings with them. Here, as you can see on the x-axis are the social emotional domains that I measured by my survey. And on the y-axis are the probabilities of problems in that area. And you can see here we have a group of students representing almost a quarter of the student population, exhibiting some form of co-occurring assertion, engagement, and internalizing issues that are represented by the 3 pigs there. There are a lot of other details that I did with this data and in my communication with the school, but let me highlight another group of students that I would say was very instrumental in shaping my current work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide, please, Lisa. I found this group of students in my data indicating a high all pattern of social emotional needs there. And when I look into the details of this data, what I was finding was that this group of students were predominantly African-American girls. And they were rating in my survey that they did not think that it was important to be engaged in school. Next slide, please, Lisa. Now, I use this data, this preliminary data that I had as the basis for my Spencer Foundation grant, which I secured in my 2nd year. And this Spencer grant that I received allowed me to follow this cohort of students through 12th grade. And on top of that, it also allowed me to collect data from teachers. So for every student who completes a social emotional screener, I have one teacher who best knows the student to independently complete a screener. And these allowed me to actually compare student-teacher ratings. Next click, please, Lisa. Again, there are lots of details, but in the interest of time, what I was finding is that agreement between students and teachers, it matters in understanding student outcomes. What do I mean by that? Next click, Lisa. For student-teacher dyads, where there's a mutual rating for communication, what I was finding is that this student had an average of 2 disciplinary referrals. Next click. For dyads, next click again, please. For dyads, when there's an under rating by teacher, in other words, student is rating here, teacher is saying, no, you are not, you are way below where you think you are. What I'm finding is this student averaged 8 disciplinary referrals. Next click, and a click again. And I think this is where the story gets interesting. For dyads, when there's an over rating by teachers, what I'm finding is that this student was being referred for disciplinary issues 4 times. Probably the teacher might be thinking that, this student might be too outspoken and is deemed to be a disciplinary issues. But nonetheless, my Spencer Foundation grant allowed me to continue this work and to collect longitudinal data from both students and teachers and to expand on these findings that I had. Next click, Lisa. Now, I managed to collect student data with my Spencer Small Grant all the way until 12th grade. Thank goodness I collected my last wave of student data in January 2020 before the pandemic shut our schools. Unfortunately, I was not able to collect my last wave of teacher data. But ever since the pandemic, I had to carefully consider the next steps of my research with whatever data I had. And this is where pivoting my research was crucial. And I considered what my data was telling me as it relates to social emotional learning, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, remember what I mentioned earlier about the group of students with high all social emotional problems, which was predominantly African-American girls? I lost them in my longitudinal sample. They either dropped out or were expelled from school. And remember, I shared that in 9th grade, we knew that they were not feeling belong to school. We could have done something to support them socially and emotionally, and we have failed those students. Next clip, please, Lisa. And in the context of the current societal challenges, it is our responsibility to help young people understand their sense of identity, foster a sense of agency for positive change, and ultimately help them find their sense of belonging in this increasingly diverse and globalized society. Next slide, please. So Spencer's Foundation's grant was really timely and foundational for me, and it served to be a stepping stone for the many other grants that I have received. Can you click twice, Lisa, please? Thank you. To a large extent, I was able to leverage on the experience gained from my Spencer grant to tell a story and use that as a basis for the other grants that focus on promoting social emotional learning and to foster greater diversity, equity, and inclusion in school. Next slide. In my research trajectory, the Spencer grant has laid a strong foundation for me to understand the context of student-teacher relationships in the last 3-4 years. And this sets me up for the next stage in my career to be understanding the broader systems that impact student success. Next click, please, Lisa. I'll give you some insights into next steps at my end. I'm working with our Illinois Extension Office and a charter school network in Chicago to be integrating social and emotional learning into their math and science curriculum to address the disparities in STEM education. At a broader level, we also need to be engaging parents to promote social and emotional learning, which is the focus of my Healing Illinois grants that I've received. And to a larger extent, we need to be engaging the community. And this is work that I'm doing in some recent grants that I've received to be working with the Danville and the Muhammad schools. So this has been my experience of my journey on funded research as it relates to social and emotional learning. Honestly, it has not been easy work, but this is really important work that needs to be done in this current context. And I appreciate this opportunity to be sharing with you my work. Thank you.
Kevin, that was really great. And you made it with 4 seconds to spare. Incredibly impressive. Not only the presentation, more impressive is the career arc that you described. And I'm so glad you mentioned the Campus Research Board grants because, I mean, Jenny may not be that familiar with them. Lisa is very familiar with them. We promote these, even though it's not a grant that we control, it's completely internal. It's run by the Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovation. It's hugely important for young faculty to get those early because it does just what you described. It's a stepping stone to external funding. And without further ado, I'm going to reintroduce Rochelle Gutierrez, who's going to talk about her Spencer Large grant that she received and how she has had to pivot and adapt to the current context. Thank you.
Guidava. I would like to start by greeting land as relative, recognizing that this is the first steps towards a process of rematriation. Dr. Seelig talked about the specific ancestral and unceded territories that we're on. And I think what's important for us is in thinking about these land acknowledgements is that they don't just become a box that's checked, that we actually need to be thinking about what truths are we living and what are the right relations that we want to be in. And so part of the truth for me is not only naming that the University of Illinois has forcefully removed nations from this place to be able to offer the University of Illinois courses, but also thinking about what's my responsibility, what's my role in the process of getting into right relations. For me, part of that is that my research aims to dismantle, to identify and dismantle how mathematics colludes with anti-Blackness and settler colonialism, and in particular thinking about how can we think about centering are more than human relatives, land, plants, animals, sky, water, as our teachers through mathematics. If we think about mathematics just being the study of patterns, in what way are these more than human relatives actually offering us patterns? I don't see my slides, so I'm not sure if they've disappeared. I see Rajiv.
Lisa, you had them up a second ago.
Let me try again.
So I'll just say that as a kind of segue to the slides, that part of that work is preparing teachers to be able to deconstruct the narratives about mathematics that circulate in society, and then helping them think about how do they become advocates for students so that we can not just accept the forms of mathematics, the ways that mathematics has formatted our lives and has kind of colluded with anti-Blackness and settler colonialism, but that how do we kind of start writing a new narrative in our society. So you can move forward. I'm doing this work in collaboration with two fantastic colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, Carrie Coca, and at Kennesaw State University, Marielle Myers. So the reason that you're going to see some like little yellow headings at the tops of these slides is really just to kind of give you a sense of the timing of all of this, because what happened was we had a set of tools. There was kind of a suite of 4 different tools that we were going to be trying to use with pre-service teachers across 3 different campuses at Pittsburgh, at Kennesaw State, and at the University of Illinois. And so we had this suite of tools already developed. We had proposed our project to go work with teachers in different contexts, in different teacher education programs, in different level, like some were K-5 teachers, some were secondary, middle school, or high school math teachers, all mathematics people. And this suite of tools, which are referred to as the political conocimiento in teaching mathematics tools, is arguing for this 4th basis of knowledge that teachers need. The teachers don't just need knowledge of content, knowledge of students, or ways of teaching, but they actually need this 4th knowledge, which is about the politics and how do they navigate the politics of teaching, and in particular, the politics of mathematics. So we had this set of tools that we were excited to be able to launch with teachers. We got our grant letter in March 20th, and then the pandemic hit, and on May 4th, as a team, we had a meeting to say, what are we going to do with this? Because, can we get to the next slide? All of our tools were, the one before it, all of our tools were these physical cards with role play activities, with people sorting cards around on tables, moving things around, mapping exercises where they had little discs and they had places where they would put their cards, with handouts, and none of that was going to work. There was ways in which people were going to come into a room and not only act out certain things, but there was also going to be part of what they did was they moved to different corners of a room depending on how they stood, what their stance was on the scenario that they had been given. And all of these are scenario based, meaning that these are political situations that real teachers have faced. And they were going to have to try to say, what do they understand is going on in the scenario? And then also what might they do about what's going on in the scenario? And then we would actually help them rehearse for how they would deal with these in their school spaces. So the idea of the physicality of it, of moving things around, of bodies moving in the room was really important. And now we were going to have to move to a virtual format. At that time on May 4th, when we had that meeting, we still didn't even know what our universities were doing with instruction. We weren't sure how all this was going to work. We weren't sure what part of our work was predicated on the idea that they were going to be observing in classrooms with teachers, with other students, and some of that was going to just fly out the window. Next slide. So I got an Illinois Campus Research Board grant that was to pilot these tools. And I actually got this grant. We applied for the Spencer grant. And then I knew that we wanted to try to pilot the tools with practicing teachers. And I knew that we wanted to do that with the hard copy. I thought that might position us as more advanced, more reputable for being able to use the tools in multiple sites. And so I got this grant that was going to help to further develop the cards, help with the theatrical cues, and all that had to get shifted to an online platform. So you see some of our design ideas there on the side of kind of how we can even think about this differently. Next slide. So on June 29th, so again, think back May 4th, we had this meeting of what in the world are we going to do? June 29th, we actually had our suite of tools virtual now on a totally different platform. Now thinking about teachers who are not going to be in rooms together with each other. Some of these are going to be people who maybe don't even know each other. And we're going to run these tools. And so we piloted them during the summer and really had a very different experience. But what that opened up for us was now we had moments of being able to capture different things on screen. So can we go to the next slide? So some of the benefits of these virtual tools, so what presented itself as like a challenge, oh my God, what are we going to do in this pandemic, actually shifted our tools to have a kind of depth to them that they didn't previously have. So in the fall and the spring of this academic year, we used these tools in 3 different sites, 3 different universities. And what we found were the benefits of these virtual tools was that, one, now we can run these professional development sessions with people all across the world. So we ran them in the summer. I ran them in the summer with teachers across the nation. And that helped me see, what does this look like when you try to run it with people who aren't in the same space? We recognize that if you set up several computers with breakout rooms, you don't actually need research assistants to show up to these professional development sessions to take field notes or to hold cameras and record things, and it allowed us to have multiple simultaneous role plays. We used to have everybody in the room would come together and we'd practice different things. And then one group would come forward and would do the role play. They would rehearse, how is this person going to act in this scenario? How are you going to convince this person who just made this deficit-based comment about your students, or who just said, we can't change the curriculum because that's the way mathematics is. It's apolitical. 2 + 2 is 4 no matter where you go. How are you going to try to persuade this person to have a more open conversation? And the person that you're speaking to is going to be an antagonizer on purpose, because that's part of our role playing. How are we going to do this? Now we had multiple breakout rooms with people being able to practice multiple sessions in different spaces. We also found, because we didn't have hard cards that we had printed out, which we originally had planned, now if we wanted to tweak the scenarios, it was a simple matter of like just on screen, changing the language, making the card bigger, making the card smaller, making it vertical, making it horizontal, whatever we wanted to do. And so that was really helpful for us, because I had developed the tools in a space that was serving middle school and high school teachers, and my colleagues were working in elementary classrooms. And so some of the scenarios we had and some of the narratives that were written in mathematics weren't familiar for elementary, especially the K-2 age teachers. It allowed us to view all the boards at once. So now, before the students would be working on tables, we would have to walk around. Now we could see live everybody working on their boards, moving things around in groups, sorting their cards, and we could see if anybody had problems. We could see who needed help, but without kind of interfering in that work. In other words, we wouldn't walk up to a group and stop them mid-conversation and kind of say, do you need help? And maybe stall them from doing what they were in the midst of having a deep conversation about. And then when we combine this with Google Slides, we just had a whole nother level of additional data that we were collecting that was not just the video of them doing this work in Zoom, but was documenting their progress in those slides. And then what was really great for us was, in the end, having screenshots, being able to literally go back to the boards that people were working on when we did our interviews and saying, we ran through these things. We could show them the slideshow and say, like, in the beginning, we introduced this idea of creative insubordination, and here's the 6 strategies. And then I put you in breakout rooms and you went and did this thing. And here's your board that you worked with, Carolyn and Diana and Devon. And here's what you guys came up with. Tell me a little bit more about that process. So now we could literally get them back into the moment of being in that professional development. And this was super helpful for us because everybody was zoomed out. People did not want to do interviews with us, or it was more difficult to get people to do interviews. But when we said, we'll run the professional development with you, and when it's convenient, we can come back and interview you, that was a huge boon to us being able to collect additional data, because we could set up those interviews when it was convenient for participants. If their kids went to sleep, we could have the interviews at 9 p.m. if that was convenient for them. We could have it on a weekend. They didn't have to come into the building. And then our publications are actually capturing this shift in the tools and methodologies that we have, both from the point of view of saying, what have we learned from having to use new tools, which has given us an insight to the process that we've constructed, but also we're using the tools to present our work at conferences. And so just the mapping and how we sort and show data has been really powerful. Next slide. So we have more challenges ahead of us for the fall. We're still going to need to print these cards. I mean, we were at the level of discussions of like, how thick should these discs be? What's the feel of it in your hand? How could you? And we didn't get to the printing. So we're going to have to print these cards and the discs and the placeholders and things. We're now going to have to think about how do we get more research assistants, because we are now going to need people to work in cameras and answer questions and take field notes when this is all going face to face in the fall. And I'm going to need to teach the partner sites how to do the physical card technologies, because when we launched this, the idea was they were going to learn how to do these physical cards and the role plays and the acting and all of that. But instead I had to teach them the virtual versions, and we refined those virtual versions over this year. And now we're going back to the hard copy versions, and I'm going to have to get them into that space because they haven't used the hard copies. And so it's raising issues for us of maybe we want a hybrid version. Maybe we want to use these hard cards, and then we also want to connect that with doing some Google Slides, or maybe there's one version out of the 4 tools that we would have them do online. Again, this offers a lot of options for us, as teacher education has a lot of constraints around what you can use your time for, and we can do some things asynchronously. The good thing is that some of the money that we saved in year 1, so there was no travel, there was no purchasing of cameras or transcription people that we needed, because Otter AI could just transcribe all of this. So some of that money is just going to shift into other years. We're also now ahead of the game because our dissemination process was trying to not only write op-eds to talk about the politics that teachers are navigating in their schools, but also to think about a platform where other people could start using these tools. And now, because the tools we've created a virtual version of, there's going to be so much easier for people. Those were our goals for year 4, and now we're kind of ahead on those goals. That's all I have to say.
Great, thanks very much. And it's good that you mentioned at the end that you have money left over and things to do differently, because Spencer, as with many other foundations, but Spencer in particular as well, has been very flexible with allowing people to repurpose, get no cost extensions, things like that. So, and we're going to finish with Jenny talking a little bit about just looking forward in the current context. A lot has happened over the past year, 2 years, even 5 years from some perspectives. So I'm going to let her speak to that.
Rajiv, do you want me to just not use slides and just say a couple brief words so we can get into Q&A? How would you like it?
It's whatever you're comfortable with. That's fine with me.
I'm sure people need to run at 1, so just to respect time. So I just want to say it was so fascinating to hear from both Dr. Tan and Dr. Gutierrez. So thank you for sharing your work. Spencer is more of a light touch foundation. As Rajiv was saying, we're not heavy-handed in needing to rework your projects or, and using the funding to spur other funding and to move forward with your work. We respect the researchers to do all of that and to do it well. And it's just wonderful to hear about where your work has gone. So thank you. So I was just going to briefly mention that, everybody probably knows that we are running a new racial equity initiative right now, but that while this is a special initiative that we have, that is, in honor of our 50th anniversary and kind of pushing the field to imagine new possibilities in this, in equity and racial equity in particular, that this is not something that is new. We are interested in racial equity clearly for both of these projects, but also across all of our grant programs. However, right now we do have 2 specific programs. We have a special grant program on racial equity. We have an upcoming deadline for that, and I have the deadlines on the slide so we can share those. But and then we also have a conference grant that we're running right now that is focused on racial equity and innovative research methods. So I encourage folks to look at the websites for both of those. But then all of our other grant programs also welcome racial equity focused work. And then just sort of lastly, our racial equity initiative involves not only commissioning specific research projects and open equity special grant programs, but also convening scholars, to work with other stakeholders to develop research agendas and seed collaborations and discuss sort of strategies for moving forward. And then finally, that we're also collaborating with other philanthropic organizations to think about educational equity in philanthropy at sort of a sort of broader national and international level. So thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure. We've only had a couple of questions submitted, and I'm just going to ask those quickly, and then, please feel free for the panelists to ask other ones or have a discussion on any of the topics that have been raised. One was, how does Spencer evaluate proposals that focus on developing quantitative methods?
So how do we review those proposals? So that's the question. Yeah, so I will just say a little bit about our review process or generally across all of our grant programs. As I mentioned earlier, we have moved to a model where we send all of our proposals out for external review. So we spend a lot of our time working on creating panels of reviewers for each of our programs, and then working with them to clarify, what the requirements are for our review process internally. And then we match your proposal with a scholar who has methodological expertise. So in this case, with quantitative methods, and then also a topical area of expertise that matches or is aligned with what you are proposing. And then they review your proposal and all of your materials, clearly anonymously for all of the PIs, and they send those to us. And then we use that as program staff. We review their reviews, we review all of your content, and then we use that to make decisions. And in our larger programs, it goes back out for review. So that's true across all of our programs. But those of us then who have less quantitative expertise on staff are clearly drawing on folks who have it in the field and are able to talk to us about the key points of your proposals.
And this is a question I'm sure you get everywhere you go. I mean, anytime you give any kind of presentation, lecture, otherwise. What are some key characteristics of successful proposals to the Spencer Foundation?
Great question. So I had a little bit of that lingo in my last slide, so I'm happy to share it. So a couple of big things. One, and I can kind of talk about this also from sort of pitfalls or sort of common challenges that we see in proposals. And so one is we're field initiated, and that's what we say all over our website. And what we mean by this is that aside from our special racial equity grant program, we are the onus of arguing for the importance of the research is on the PI. So we are open to all, to education research, broadly conceived, wherever it occurs across the lifespan. And so this means that methodologically and topically, we're very open. So when folks say, would you be interested in this? The answer is most likely yes. But you need to work to communicate that within your proposal. So one of those ways is to make sure that you're situating your work within literature and theory in the field. And if you are coming from maybe slightly outside of education, being able to pull on the education literature in order to situate your work as well is very important. Another key piece is that being able to align all of the parts of your research design. So when you discuss your direction of inquiry, and then you discuss, your theoretical frames and your literature into your research design, we want to be able to see that the alignment is there, that your methods are matching the question that you're asking, that your analysis is informed by your theoretical framework, and so that this alignment is quite clear. Another piece to consider is we are interested in work that makes theoretical and/or empirical contributions to the field. It's a very competitive, all of our programs are highly competitive. So we want to see that you're thinking not just about the project itself, but what that means for the world.
We had a question submitted in the chat, and that is, Dr. Tan did a great job of telling his story of how his funded projects have built on one another. How important is it for our proposal to fit into a clear narrative of our research trajectory versus a new research area, for example?
That's a wonderful question, because I think we heard from both of our colleagues today that they have been able to take their projects and kind of move them in different ways for other funding. And I would say that, for our larger grant programs, not the small grants programs, but the larger programs, if you do have pilot data, for example, or if you have done some work in a similar vein, being able to draw upon that, it's not required. It's not required at all. However, I think we all know that if you have something tangible to talk about, it's a little easier to describe. So in that case, if you have it, definitely bring it in. In terms of your trajectory, through the life of the grant and then possibly beyond, we do ask you to submit CVs. And so the reviewers and all of us on staff have all of your qualifications sort of laid out in front of us. You also have a project team narrative. And so you'll be able to talk about the different folks on your team. So if you have some advisors that, let's say you do quantitative work, but you want to move into a mixed methods format, and you have a qualitative scholar who is willing and able and excited to join your project, then you provide that information as well. You can have funds set aside for these different folks, et cetera. And that will also help reviewers and program staff really see that you are deeply thinking about the different aspects of your project, as well as how to make your project successful.
Thank you. I'm so glad you said that bit about pilot data. Of course, it's not required, but I can tell you that in addition to Spencer Foundation, many of the funders we deal with love the fact that you have a pilot project or you have proof of concept for your idea. So that is really important. I'll give you another plug for the campus research boards if you're not already looking at those. I think you should. One more question came in. Thinking about Dr. Gutierrez's note that the scenarios came from the teachers, would the Spencer Foundation welcome co-design or participatory approaches that involve close collaborations with partners?
Absolutely. So we are interested in all sorts of action research. And again, what's important for us is thinking about how the decision to do action work is aligned with the questions that you're asking and the processes that you're thinking through. So being able to pull on the participatory action research literature, or being able to pull on community-based research methods, literature, to be able to, really structure the argument and the design and why you've designed it that way is important, but we are definitely interested in those methodologies. And just to say, Rajiv, too, just another comment on the pilot study, I just want to also be clear that, all of our grant programs, but also our small grant program is very popular with early career scholars that may not have pilot data. So I don't want to say like, don't submit if you don't have pilot data. We're actually very interested too, sometimes there are risks to be taken. And so again, it falls on the PI to really make a clear articulation as to what it is that you're trying to do, so that reviewers and program staff can really we need to be able to visualize what's going to happen. So being able to kind of hook into that and really explain that, you don't need pilot data to do so. It just so happens if you have pilot data, it tends to be easier to use that to describe your work.
Right. I didn't mean to suggest you shouldn't ever apply if you don't have it. I'm just saying we have an internal resource that's really terrific for our junior faculty and our senior faculty. Frankly, you can get these later on in your career. You can get more than one. Some people think that you only get one. We don't have any other questions coming in from the participants. Panelists, feel free to ask Jenny questions of your own if you have them, or expand on some of the points that have been made. We're really grateful that you took the time. We still have about 4 minutes, so let's use them to our advantage. Kevin, Rochelle? Oh. I will ask, I know you said that the racial equity special research grants were a celebration of kind of the 50th anniversary of Spencer. Is there any discussion of those becoming permanent offerings in terms of the regular cycle of offerings? I know Spencer's always been interested in those themes, but it seems like they've gotten a very positive response. And I'm just curious as to if that's going to become a permanent member, so to speak, of the Spencer Grants family.
That's a great question, Rajiv. And I will say that right now, I can't answer that question. And that, we are always thinking about what the right way to lead the field is, and to ask for, work that's pushing the boundaries, and really thinking about what equity in education really can look like in the future. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, fair enough. Lisa, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to say thank you to all of our panelists today and everyone that joined us. This was our first webinar of this kind. And if you want to see more of these, please let us know. So thank you to Kevin and Rochelle for sharing a little about your research and your process with Spencer. And thank you so much for Jenny for joining us and, just talking about Spencer and helping people understand more about the Spencer Foundation. We're excited to see our partnership grow, in the coming years.
Also, I would just say, Lisa, I did not provide my contact information in any, I can add a slide maybe to the slide deck or however, but I can just say right now for folks that if you'd like to email me at Spencer, it's JSEELIG at Spencer, SPENCER.org. And I'd be happy to take your questions.
And I did copy and paste the deadlines into the chat if anyone wants to grab those, and we will make the recording available on the education YouTube channel if people want to go back and look, and I'll be sure to add that information in the slide deck before we post it, Jenny.
Right. Thank you, Jenny. And before you leave, I just wanted you to maybe touch on one last thing, and that was when we met in preparation for this panel, you mentioned that Spencer was actually offering consultations, brief consultations with faculty if they wanted 15 minutes, I think you said. If you could just reiterate how that works, that would be terrific.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we have a couple of resources that we've been working on as a staff over the last year to support scholars in the field. So building capacity of scholars is actually a big goal, a central commitment of ours, which I spoke about earlier. And so we have produced some writing guides for folks who are early career or would like to share with their grad students different parameters around how Spencer is thinking about the sort of different requirements and categories of things within our proposals. I would suggest you take a look at our website for those. And then we also are offering what we're calling office hours. So they're only 15 minutes. So they're very fast and very brief, but there is a link also on our website, and you can find that, and it will open up different times. Program officers put times in every month. So towards the end of the month, we usually put in the times for the next month, and you can sign up for one of those. It won't tell you who you're signing up with, but my colleagues are all amazing people and able to answer your questions and talk with you about your projects.
That is great. Thank you so much. And thank you for making the time for us. This has been terrific. A final plug, we also have OFR's office hours in the College of Education. So if you want to talk to about Spencer or any other funder, come and see us, and we will happily direct you to Jenny if she has time available, or if other program officers have time available for those consultations. But thanks again. This has been really great.
Thank you so much for having me. This is wonderful.
Hopefully next time it will be in person. And I promise to take you to some of those restaurants we talked about.
Absolutely.
Okay. Take care and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.